On the night of October 28, 1944, in the black, churning waters of the Aegean Sea, the Royal Navy wrote one of the most astonishing and defiant chapters in the history of naval warfare. It is a story that sounds like a work of fiction, a desperate gamble born of hubris, but it is a story verified by the logs of 3 navies and the eyewitness accounts of hundreds of terrified men. The British destroyer HMS Broke, a veteran of the North Atlantic convoys and the D-Day landings, found herself alone, outnumbered, and surrounded. Before her lay a German naval force, tasked with evacuating thousands of besieged troops from the Greek islands, a force that included a Leviathan, the mighty German light cruiser Emden. The Emden displaced over 7,000 tons, a veritable fortress of steel bristling with 8 5.9-inch guns and torpedo tubes. The Broke, in stark contrast, was a modest destroyer of just over 1,700 tons, her main armament a quartet of 4.7-inch guns. By the cold mathematics of naval combat, she was hopelessly outclassed. Her captain was ordered to stop the German evacuation at all costs, and his searchlights pinned his ship in an icy glare, and shells began to tear the night apart around him. He made a decision that would defy every principle of fleet engagement. He would not retreat. He would not surrender. He would turn his frail destroyer into a battering ram and charge a vessel more than 4 times her size. This is the story of a captain who, when faced with impossible odds, decided the only way to stop a giant was to run it through the heart. To understand the sheer audacity of what transpired that October night, we must first chart the deteriorating German position in the Aegean in the autumn of 1944. The tide of war had turned irrevocably. With the Soviet Red Army advancing relentlessly through the Balkans and the Allies pressing north through Italy, Germany's grip on its occupied territories in Greece and the Myriad Islands was slipping. The Wehrmacht was now in a desperate race to evacuate its garrisons from islands like Leros, Kos, and Samos before they were cut off and captured. This evacuation, codenamed Operation Comet, was a complex and dangerous undertaking. The Aegean was no longer a German lake. Royal Air Force aircraft from bases in Cyprus and Libya prowled the skies by day, while the Royal Navy, particularly the potent force of destroyers operating from Alexandria, contested the sea lanes by night. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, assembled a motley but powerful evacuation fleet. Its centerpiece was the light cruiser Emden. Launched in 1925 and modernized several times, the Emden was a prestigious ship, a training vessel for cadets that had seen action in the Baltic and now served as a flagship. She was escorted by a flotilla of modern, viciously effective Type 39 torpedo boats, fast, heavily armed vessels like the T-23, T-20, and T-16, and a convoy of transports and landing barges packed with troops. The British response was Force 120, a collection of destroyers led by the 12th Destroyer Flotilla. Among them was HMS Broke, F-83, a Baron-class destroyer commanded by 38-year-old Lieutenant Commander Brian de Courcy-Ireland. De Courcy-Ireland was a seasoned and aggressive officer, known for his calm demeanor under fire and a tactical boldness that bordered on recklessness. His ship and her crew were equally tested. The Broke had spent the early war years on punishing Arctic convoy runs to Murmansk, facing U-boats, the Luftwaffe, and some of the worst weather on the planet. She had supported the Normandy landings, firing in support of troops on Omaha Beach. Her company was a mix of veteran sailors who had seen it all and younger men experiencing combat for the first time. On the evening of October 28th, the Broke, along with her sister ship HMS Meteor and the Greek destroyer Audrias, was on patrol north of the island of Samos. The orders from Vice Admiral H. Bernard Rawlings were unequivocal: intercept and destroy any German evacuation convoy they encountered. Intelligence suggested a major movement was imminent. As darkness fell, the 3 destroyers formed a line ahead, cutting through the calm seas at 20 knots, their radars sweeping the horizon. The crews were at action stations, the atmosphere a familiar cocktail of boredom and coiled tension. The smell of cordite, oil, and cold salt air filled the ships. On the bridge of the Broke, de Courcy-Ireland peered into the growing darkness, knowing the Germans would have to move under cover of night. He did not have long to wait. At 2,145 hours, the greenish glow of the radar scope in the Broke's Combat Information Center delivered the contact they had been waiting for. A cluster of blips appeared to the north-northwest. approximately 12 miles away. The plot quickly resolved into multiple vessels, one large return, several medium-sized, and numerous smaller contacts. It was the German convoy. A signal was flashed to Meteor and Adria's. Course was altered to intercept. The British ships increased speed to 28 knots, their bows slicing through the water, white foam glowing faintly in the darkness. By 2230, lookouts on the German torpedo boats spotted dark shapes against the slightly lighter horizon to the south. The alarm was raised. Searchlight crews on the Emden and the escorts stood ready. Gunnery officers adjusted their stereoscopic rangefinders, waiting for the order to illuminate. For the British, the plan was a classic destroyer night attack. Use speed and surprise to close the range, fire torpedoes from their banks of tubes, then engage with guns at close quarters before disengaging under a smoke screen. But almost immediately, the plan began to unravel. As the range closed to 8,000 yards, the German commander, demonstrating superb situational awareness, did not wait to be attacked. At 2,247, a dozen powerful searchlights from the Emden and her escorts snapped on simultaneously, their brilliant white beams lancing across the water, frantically searching. One by one, they found their targets. The Broke was the first to be caught. A blinding pillar of light pinned her amidships, illuminating every detail of her superstructure, her guns, the stunned faces of men on her decks. It was a moment of surreal vulnerability. It was like being on a stage. One sailor later recalled. You felt naked. You knew every gun in the German fleet was now looking right at you. The psychological shock was immediately followed by physical violence. The Emden's main battery, controlled by its sophisticated fire direction system, spoke first. The night exploded with a deep, rolling crump of 5.9-inch guns firing. Tall waterspouts, glowing white in the searchlights, erupted around the Broke, some so close the ship shuddered from the concussion. Shrapnel whined through the air, clattering against the steel hull. On the bridge, Courcy-Ireland barked orders. Hardy starboard. All guns, engage the searchlights. Make smoke. The Broke heeled over violently as the helm was put over. Her own 4.7-inch guns cracked back, their sharper reports lost in the thunder of the German salvos. Their shells were aimed not at the Emden's armored belt, a futile gesture, but at the blinding searchlight platforms. Meanwhile, the Type 39 torpedo boats surged forward like angry wolves, their faster-firing 105mm and 37mm guns adding a staccato of muzzle flashes to the chaos. They began launching spreads of torpedoes, their tracks invisible in the lit-up maelstrom. The Meteor and Adria's were also illuminated and engaged. The battle descended into a close-range, close-quarters melee, a swirling, chaotic brawl where formations dissolved and each ship fought for its life. The air grew thick with the smell of burnt powder and the tang of sea spray mixed with smoke. For 20 minutes, the Broke danced a deadly ballet. She twisted and turned, her engine screaming at full emergency power, her gunners firing as fast as the loaders could feed the breaches. A hit from a 105mm shell struck her forward superstructure, killing 3 men manning the Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns and starting a fierce fire. Another shell ripped through a thin plating aft, flooding a compartment. Damaged control parties scrambled through choking smoke, battling flames and sealing leaks. But Courcy-Ireland's primary objective remained: the troop transports. He drove his ship forward, attempting to break through the screen of torpedo boats. At one point, the Broke and the T-23 passed so close abeam that the crews could see each other's faces, exchanging fire with machine guns and small arms in a terrifying, intimate exchange. A German machine gun burst shattered the glass of the Broke's bridge wing, wounding the signalman. By 2315, the situation was critical. The Broke was damaged and taking on water. The Adria's had suffered a catastrophic hit forward, losing her bows, and was falling out of line. The Meteor was heavily engaged with 2 torpedo boats. The German convoy, though delayed, was still largely intact and pressing on towards the safety of neutral Turkish waters, which lay frighteningly close. The Emden loomed like a malevolent castle, her searchlights still probing, her guns methodically firing. It was clear the torpedo attack had failed in the confusion and the punishing defensive fire. On the Broke's bridge, the reports were grim. Forward magazine flooding, Captain. Speed reduced to 24 knots, sir. Multiple fires on deck. Courcy-Ireland assessed the tactical picture. His mission was to stop the evacuation. The transports were slipping away. His ship was hurt. And then, through the smoke and glare, he saw his opportunity, or perhaps his last, desperate resort. The Emden, in maneuvering to protect the convoy, had presented her broadside. She was a mere 2,000 yards away, a colossal silhouette backlit by the flashes of her own guns. What happened next was not the product of a long, calculated deliberation, but the instantaneous decision of a fighting captain who saw only one path to completing his mission. If he could not sink the transports with torpedoes or gunfire, he would cripple the command ship, the heart of the enemy force. He would render the Emden unable to command or protect her flock. And he would do it not with a weapon he no longer had the advantage to use, but with the one weapon he had left. The HMS broke herself. His voice, calm but edged with steel, cut through the din on the bridge. Starboard 30. All ahead flank. Steer for the cruiser. Stand by for ramming. There was a moment of stunned silence. The officer of the watch repeated the order, his voice tight. Starboard 30, sir. All ahead flank. Steer for the cruiser. The engine room telegraphs rang. Deep below, the stokers shoveled coal frantically, pushing the battered destroyer's turbines to their absolute limit. A vibration ran through the entire hull as the Broke shook herself and surged forward, turning not away from the giant, but directly toward it. The moments that followed were a blur of terrifying acceleration and focused intent. The Broke, trailing smoke and flame, became a projectile aimed at the Emden's midships. On the German cruiser's bridge, the maneuver was initially misinterpreted. Fregating-Kapitän Henigst and his officers likely believed the British destroyer was making a final, desperate torpedo run, turning to bring her tubes to bear. The Emden's secondary batteries and the nearby torpedo boats redoubled their fire, concentrating a storm of steel on the approaching ship. Shells slammed into the Broke with horrifying frequency. One struck the base of her funnel, sending a shower of red-hot splinters across the deck. Another exploded against B gun mount, silencing it and killing the entire crew. The forward fire raged unchecked. Casualties mounted. The ship was being shot to pieces. Yet she did not waver. The distance closed with terrifying speed. 1,500 yards, 1,000 yards 50. The Emden grew from a large ship to a monstrous wall of darkened steel. Her gun flashes now deafening, the muzzle blasts physically palpable. On the Broke, men braced. Some, with nothing left to do at their stations, simply wrapped their arms around whatever solid object they could find. A ladder, a stanchion, a gun mount. The sound was a hellish orchestra. The scream of incoming shells, the crash of impacts, the roar of the fires, the deep-throated bellow of the Emden's main battery, and over it all, the high-pitched whine of the Broke's overstressed turbines. In the engine room, the heat was suffocating. Men worked half-blind in the dim emergency lighting, watching the gauges tremble at the limits, knowing they were steering their own tomb into the side of a giant. Aboard the Emden, the realization dawned too late. The destroyer was not turning away. It was not launching torpedoes. It was maintaining a deadly straight line, aimed directly amidships. Panicked shouts erupted on the German bridge. Hard at port. Emergency full astern. But a cruiser of the Emden's size and momentum cannot turn on a dime. She began a slow, ponderous swing, but it was futile. The Broke was committed. At approximately 2,335 hours, at a speed of nearly 25 knots, HMS Broke struck the port side of the German light cruiser Emden. The sound of the collision was unlike anything any survivor had ever heard. A deep, grinding, shrieking cacophony of tearing metal that drowned out even the gunfire. The Broke's strengthened bow, designed for North Atlantic seas, acted like a can opener. It sliced into the Emden's hull just aft of her bridge, penetrating deep into her vitals. The force of the impact was colossal. On the Broke, every man was thrown violently forward. Those not holding on were catapulted across decks or into bulkheads. The entire forward section of the destroyer compressed like an accordion, her plates buckling and her frame snapping. The shockwave traveled the length of the ship, knocking out power, severing steam lines, and plunging sections into darkness. For a few terrible seconds, the two ships were locked together in a deadly embrace. The smaller broke buried almost 30 feet into the side of the cruiser. On the Emden, the effect was catastrophic. The ramming point was a critical area, near boiler rooms and machinery spaces. Seawall-thick steel was rent open to the sea, and the Aegean poured in through a wound more than 40 feet long. Internal bulkheads were shorn away. Compartments flooded instantly. The cruiser shuddered from stem to stern, her power flickering. The sudden flooding caused an immediate list to port. In the chaos, German damage control was initially paralyzed. The shock of the impact, both physical and psychological, was overwhelming. For the troops huddled in the transports nearby, the sight was one of pure nightmare. Their mighty protector, the flagship, had been speared by a destroyer a fraction of her size, and the two vessels were now locked in a death struggle, lit by fires and the relentless glare of the remaining searchlights. But the Broke's ordeal was far from over. She was stuck fast. Her bow was crumpled and embedded, and the Emden's list was pulling her over. Worse, the German guns that could still bear began to fire at point-blank range. The Broke's bridge was raked by 37mm cannon fire. Her remaining gun crews, dazed and bloodied, returned fire with machine guns and their one operable 4.7-inch gun, shooting literally up into the superstructure of the cruiser. It was a scene from a medieval siege, fought across yards of tangled steel. Men on both ships became infantry, throwing grenades and firing rifles at the enemy so close they could see the whites of their eyes. The Broke was taking on water rapidly from her own collision damage. She was trapped on fire and being systematically blasted apart at a range of 0. For Commander D. Courcy-Ireland and his crew, the heroic act of ramming seemed to have become a suicide pact. They had struck a mighty blow, but they were now dying with their target. The turning point was born not from a change in fortune, but from the raw, unyielding will of the Broke's captain and the exceptional discipline of her surviving crew. Even as his ship was being torn apart, D. Courcy-Ireland's mind was working the problem. The mission was not complete. The Emden was hurt, but not dead. The transports were still escaping, and his ship, his command, was not yet lost. From the shattered bridge, he gave a series of orders that would define the legacy of the night. First, he ordered the release of depth charges. This was a weapon designed for submarines, but set to shallow depth and rolled off the stern racks. Their explosions in the water close to the Emden's hull could cause further shock damage and confuse the enemy. The order was executed. A series of tremendous underwater concussions rocked both vessels, adding to the chaos aboard the cruiser and potentially exacerbating her flooding. His second order was the critical one: full astern, all engines. It was a monumental gamble. The Broke's bow was crumpled and entangled in the Emden's innards. Trying to pull her out could cause catastrophic structural failure, ripping her own bow off and dooming her instantly. But staying meant certain destruction. In the engine room, the engineers, working in steam and darkness, wrestled with the controls. With a sound of protesting metal that echoed through the ship, the Broke's propellers began to thrash in reverse. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The two ships remained locked. Then, with a screech that set teeth on edge, the Broke began to move. Slowly, incrementally, she pulled herself free from the gash in the Emden's side. Torn metal screamed. As her mangled bow cleared, a torrent of water rushed into the cavity she left behind in the cruiser, worsening the Emden's list dramatically. The Broke was free, but she was a horrifying sight. Her entire forward section, for nearly 60 feet, was a twisted, wrecked mass of compressed steel. Her forecastle was gone, leveled almost to the waterline. She was down by the bow, seawater rushing into the vast open wound. She had lost all power forward, but her engines aft were still functioning, and her steering was, miraculously, partially responsive. She was a floating wreck, but she was afloat and moving, and she was still armed. D. Courcy-Ireland, seeing the Emden now listing heavily and clearly crippled, turned his attention to the original target, the transports. Bleeding, burning, and sinking slowly, the Broke turned her stern to the wounded cruiser and began to crawl away, her remaining aft guns engaging the nearest troop carrier, the Grief. This act of defiance, the mortally wounded destroyer not only extracting itself from its kill, but continuing to prosecute the attack had a profound psychological effect. The German torpedo boats, which had been moving in for the kill and the trap broke, were momentarily stunned by the sheer improbability of her breaking free. Their focus also fractured as they saw the dire state of their flagship. The Emden, with a severe list and taking on thousands of tons of water, was in a fight for her own survival. Her captain made the only decision possible. He gave the order to break off the action and run for the nearest neutral port, the Turkish island of Leros, just a few miles away. The flagship was abandoning the convoy. Pause! With the Emden fleeing, the cohesion of the German force disintegrated. The torpedo boats, now without central direction, made aggressive but disjointed attacks on the British destroyers. The Meteor, seeing the Broke's condition, moved bravely to interpose herself between her crippled sister ship and the German escorts, laying a thick smoke screen and engaging with all guns. The Greek Adria, as though Bolus, also joined the fray with her remaining weapons. In this cover, the Broke limped south, her crew performing miracles of damage control. They shored up collapsed bulkheads, jettisoned loose wreckage, and fought the fires with dwindling water pressure. Her speed was a mere 8 knots, and she was settling lower in the water. But she was still in the fight. Her gunners, with one remaining functional main gun and several pom-poms, scored hits on the Grief, starting fires and forcing the transport to sheer away in confusion. The German evacuation, meticulously planned, was now in utter disarray. The convoy scattered, some ships following the Emden toward Leros, others turning back north, their mission a failure. The turning point was this: a single, unimaginably bold act of tactical aggression, followed by a stunning display of seamanship and resilience, had broken the back of the enemy operation. The Broke had not just rammed a cruiser. She had shattered the German command's nerve and will, by refusing to die when she should have, by tearing herself free and continuing to fight. She transformed a probable British defeat into a chaotic, costly German retreat. The tiny destroyer had, through sheer force of will, stopped the giants. The legacy of the action off Samos is one of legendary audacity. Lieutenant Commander Brian D. Courcy-Ireland was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his great daring, skill, and determination. The first lieutenant of the Broke and several other crew members received decorations for gallantry. The Admiralty cited the action as a brilliant example of the offensive spirit and devotion to duty which has always characterized the destroyer service. The Broke herself was later refloated and towed, but was judged beyond economical repair and was eventually scrapped in 1945. Yet her name lived on, a byword for ruthless, close-quarters aggression. The legacy of the action off Samos is one of legendary audacity. Lieutenant Commander Brian D. Courcy-Ireland was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his great daring, skill, and determination. The first lieutenant of the Broke and several other crew members received decorations for gallantry. The Admiralty cited the action as a brilliant example of the offensive spirit and devotion to duty which has always characterized the destroyer service. The Broke herself was later refloated and towed, but was judged beyond economical repair and was eventually scrapped in 1945. Yet her name lived on, a byword for ruthless, close-quarters aggression. Tactically, the ramming of the Emden stands is one of the last and most successful deliberate ramming actions in modern naval history. It was a throwback to the age of sail, executed with 20th century steel. It proved that even in an era dominated by long-range gunnery, radar, and torpedoes, the human factor, the will of a captain, and the courage of a crew, could still decide an engagement in the most visceral way possible. It demonstrated that a numerically and materially inferior force could prevail by accepting a staggering degree of risk and executing a plan with flawless, brutal resolution. The story of the Broke is not just one of a ship fighting a cruiser. It is the story of a commander who, when confronted with a wall of enemy steel, decided the only logical response was to use his own ship as the ultimate projectile. In doing so, he turned a tiny destroyer into an immortal legend of the sea. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII-Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.